SpaceX's Starship is preparing to return to flight, Rocket Lab's Electron is also preparing for its return to flight, and Virgin Galactic wants to retire its Unity spaceplane. There's much more to come this week in Spaceflight. Rocket Lab has announced this week it is returning Electron back to flight later this month. This comes right after the company completed the investigation into the failure that happened during the last Electron launch back in September. According to Rocket Lab, the issue seems to have occurred due to an electrical arc that occurred within the power supply system, providing high voltage to the Rutherford engine motor controllers. This, in essence, shorted the battery packs that provided power to the launch vehicle second stage, eventually losing total power on the vehicle. Rocket Lab is implementing redundancies to avoid this issue going forward by performing increased fidelity vacuum testing and pressurizing the power supply system instead of keeping it in a vacuum. With the investigation complete and FAA approval in hand, Rocket Lab is now planning to return Electron to flight with these fixes in place. This return to flight mission is set to fly iQPS's QPS-SAR-5 satellite and is planned to occur within a window that opens on November 28th and goes into December. The flight would happen from New Zealand and will be the company's 10th flight of the year. Rocket Lab is aiming for a busy 2024 as well, with 22 missions on schedule, including several recovery missions on tap for Electron. 2024 will also be a busy year for the development of the company's Neutron rocket, which has successfully passed initial cryogenic testing of the second stage tanks. Another round of second stage testing will happen in the first half of 2024, and Rocket Lab is already in the process of building and testing first stage and fairing structures. The Archimedes engine is also continuing development, with full-scale hardware and assemblies being produced for testing early next year. It definitely looks like that. Despite the launch failure back in September, Rocket Lab has been able to pull itself out and is back on track once again. Speaking of Rocket Lab, we'll have the company's CEO, Peter Beck, on NSF Live this Sunday, so you probably don't want to miss that, as I'm sure he'll have a lot to talk about during the show. This week we also had quite some news from Europe during the European Space Summit that took place in Seville, Spain. During this summit, ministers from all member states of the European Union and representatives from the European Space Agency met together to put together plans and projects for Europe's future in space. Two major projects have come out of this summit. The first one involves a competition of new launch vehicles that would follow the Ariane 6 and Vega C rockets, while the other intends to kickstart a competition for commercial cargo vehicles to the ISS that could fly as early as 2028. These two projects are quite important, to say the least, because it showcases the shift in culture within the European governments with regards to the use of commercial competitive contracts for space operations. According to ESA's Director General Joseph Aschbacher, there's currently a, quote, European launcher crisis, hence the need to take this unprecedented action. If we remember back to previous episodes, Ariane 6, the replacement for the Ariane 5, is still finishing development, and ESA says it won't announce the date for its debut until it wraps up testing, which is expected to happen in the next month or so. Even then, it is not very clear whether Ariane 6 will be capable of debuting in the first half of 2024. On the other hand, Vega C, Europe's small lift launcher, is still going through testing to solve the issues found during its last launch failure and testing failure back in June of this year. This rocket is not expected to return to flight until at least 2024, so this doesn't help either. This situation has forced ESA to sign launches of its payloads on SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets. During this European Space Summit, Joseph Aschbacher also confirmed that the agency is in talks to launch the next 4 Galileo navigation satellites on 2 different Falcon 9 rockets next year, pending approval from the member governments. There are several companies that have taken up these new challenges even before they were announced. For example, German companies like the Exploration Company and Rocket Factory Augsburg are working on cargo spacecraft that could potentially resupply the International Space Station. On the launcher front, there's even more companies working on rockets from multiple places in Europe. While most of these companies are working on small launch vehicles, the launcher competition is open to everyone, including the incumbents, Arianespace and Avio. We touched on this in our previous episode, but ArianeGroup is planning upgrades to its Ariane 6 rocket with the development of a reusable upper stage already underway. The company is also developing reusable rocket technologies with a startup-like subsidiary called Meyer Space. Avio, the producer of Vega rockets, is also working on its own development path to create reusable rockets and develop Methalox engines that could be used on said rockets. So the bottom line is that even though Europe seems to be coming late to the game, there's still lots of companies out there willing to put their skin in the game and try lots of new stuff. So hopefully Europe can recover from this stronger than ever. And now let's take a look at this week in launches. Starting off the week, we had the launch of a Chang'e 7A rocket on November 3rd at 14:54 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Wenchang Satellite Launch Center. This mission was carrying the TGS-10 satellite, the 10th satellite in China's Tongxin Jishu Xi'an program, to a geostationary transfer orbit. This program is very secretive as it is part of China's military satellite program, and each of these TJS satellites may actually have different purposes, so it is currently unknown what this satellite will be for. This Falcon 9 lifted off on November 4th at 37 minutes past midnight UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The rocket was carrying a batch of 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The booster for this flight, B1058, was flying for a record 18th time, becoming the booster with the most flights in the Falcon fleet. It successfully returned back to Earth, landing on the deck of SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. Hopefully we'll see it fly for a 19th time very soon. Another Starlink launch took place this week, with liftoff taking place on November 8th at 05:05 Universal Time, also from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The Falcon 9 for this mission was carrying another batch of 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage used on this flight, B1073, was flying for an 11th time, and it successfully landed on Just Read the Instructions. With these two Starlink launches this week, SpaceX has now launched a total of 5,422 satellites, of which 365 have re-entered and 4,472 are in their operational orbit. A Chang'e 3BE lifted off on November 9th at 11:23 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying the Chinasat 6E satellite into a geostationary transfer orbit. The satellite is a direct broadcasting communications satellite for China Satcom that will be replacing Chinasat 6B. This is one of a series of replacements of aging Chinese geostationary communications satellites that has been happening over the last few years and will continue up to at least 2025. And to wrap up the week, we had another Falcon 9 launch on November 10th at 01:28 UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. Atop the Falcon 9 was the 29th resupply cargo Dragon spacecraft headed to the International Space Station. The first stage for this mission, B1081, was flying for just its second time, having previously flown on the Crew 7 mission in August. It successfully returned back to Earth, landing at SpaceX's Landing Zone 1 in Cape Canaveral. The spacecraft is carrying 2,950 kilograms of science experiments, supplies and other cargo to the ISS. This includes the Illuma-T laser communications experiment and the OR experiment, aimed at investigating atmospheric gravity waves. The Dragon for this flight, serial number C211, is flying for a second time to the ISS, having previously flown on the CRS-26 mission. It is set to dock at the front docking port of the Harmony module on November 11th at 10:41 UTC, and it will remain on station for the next month or so. Virgin Galactic has announced big changes to the near-term future plans of the company, including setting an expiration date for its Unity spaceplane. The news came out just as the company had announced the layoff of workers at its facilities in Mojave, California. According to Virgin Galactic, this was done as a strategic realignment of the company's resources. The hope is that, by doing this, the company will cut expenses on its current Spaceship 2 vehicle operations and will be able to use that to work on its Delta-class spaceships set for debut in 2025. This means that Unity, the only Spaceship 2 vehicle in the company's fleet, is soon heading for the retirement home, as the company's facilities in Mojave were the ones that allowed for in-depth inspections of the vehicle, and there's only so many flights left before such inspections are needed. Indeed, a day after this news came out, Virgin Galactic CEO Michael Colglazier confirmed Unity will be retired by the middle of next year, with the company moving from monthly flights to quarterly flights. Galactic 06 is set for January, and following that will be Galactic 07 set for April, and with that, it'll be pretty much it for the spaceplane. Colglazier did mention the possibility of flying the Galactic 08 mission on Unity around the middle of 2024, but the company hasn't decided yet on that schedule. These remaining flights on Unity would also be dedicated to those passengers willing to pay more for the flights, like researchers and other private customers with deeper pockets than most and that are willing to pay a premium price to fly before the rest. The idea is that the workforce currently working on Unity would move over to working on the Delta class vehicles around the middle of 2024 and start flights of the first one in 2025, with commercial flights planned for 2026. It is quite the replanning that Virgin is, dare I say, planning, but it definitely shows that the company is trying to not burn the least money possible while still developing new vehicles. The next launch of SpaceX's Starship is closing in as the company prepares the rocket for flight. While regulatory approval is still forthcoming, SpaceX has now installed the flight termination system on the rocket's 2 stages, Booster 9 and Ship 25. This was followed by stacking of both vehicles just last night for what is expected to be the last time, at least until it launches. The latest batch of hazard notices, navigational warnings and similar documentation points toward a launch occurring no earlier than November 15th. This also comes a week after SpaceX posted on its website the pre-launch and post-launch timeline for the second flight of Starship and a tentative period for this launch of mid-November. With all of this in place, Starship now stands in launch configuration as it awaits launch license approval. This approval is pending the conclusion of the written re-evaluation to the programmatic environmental assessment to include the new water deluge system into said assessment. This review is being done by the FAA in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which, last we knew, was undergoing a review on its own, after which it will issue a biological opinion to the FAA. Right now, we just don't know where in this process the agencies are right now. It's potentially possible that the FWS has its biological opinion already sent to the FAA, and the FAA is now only finalising the written re-evaluation for sign-off. Once signed off, the agency will be able to approve a launch license modification to remove that pesky comment on the current launch license that says that flight operations are only authorised for one flight. It does seem like, however, SpaceX is confident it will receive this license sooner rather than later, given the launch-ready status of Starship right now and all of the notices and hazard warnings pointing to a flight no earlier than November 15th. Of course, this could change, but don't fret, because now that we've featured this on today's show, the FAA will probably announce shortly it is approving the launch. I'm of course joking, but you know, it's probably going to happen, isn't it? Now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. NASA's Lucy spacecraft keeps giving us more surprises, with more data coming in from its latest encounter with asteroid Dinkinesh. We featured this story on our last episode. Lucy not only flew by this asteroid, but it also found a moon around it. Well, that was with the information and pictures that had been released last week. But this week, NASA has released pictures showing that this moon is not just one object, but 2 smaller asteroids touching each other. This discovery was made now mainly because the spacecraft has taken over a week to downlink all of the images taken during its flyby, and the ones downloaded at first showed the moon at such an angle that it was not possible to see this phenomenon. It wasn't until these images came through, taken from other angles, that the true reality of this moon was fully revealed. This discovery is really making everyone question how this system even formed in the first place with such a bizarre configuration of objects. This is just yet another example of space surprising us when we thought we were looking at something relatively dull and boring. It's not just one asteroid, there's 3. SpaceX's Crew Access Tower is one step closer to completion. The company has installed its brand new Crew Access arm for its shiny brand new tower, which will allow crew missions to take place from the world's busiest launch pad. It is not very clear whether SpaceX will install an emergency pad escape system or even if they'll clear out the tower at all for aesthetic reasons, but it does appear that SpaceX might be launching crew from here sooner than you might expect. The FAA has announced this week it has closed the mishap investigation for the failure of the debut flight of ABL Space's RS-1 rocket. This follows after the company had announced a couple of weeks ago the preliminary result of its investigation into this failure. The announcement included that the likely root cause was recirculation underneath the rocket during engine ignition due to a constrained launch mount and flame deflector system. We covered it in a lot more detail in a recent episode, do go check that out for more in-depth coverage. According to ABL's press release about the completed mishap investigation, the company identified 22 corrective actions that it would need to implement before the FAA can approve the safety of the vehicle for the public. It kinda sounds very familiar, doesn't it? It's pretty much like what happened with Starship, but this time with a rocket that can only launch about 100 times less payload to orbit. ESA has released this week the first images from its Euclid telescope, and they are otherworldly, quite literally. These images are the most detailed wide field of view images ever taken. While other telescopes such as the James Webb or Hubble may have more or equal resolution, these telescopes do not have a wide enough field of view to image much of the sky at once. Euclid, however, is capable of doing so, and in greater detail than any other wide field of view telescope ever created. The images also showcase the health of Euclid systems, which are running at full capability and will deliver literally thousands of gigabytes of data over the next few years. Euclid's main mission is to survey 1/3 of the sky with this unprecedented level of detail, which will hopefully bring us closer to understanding better the distribution of galaxies and dark matter in our universe. The United States Space Force has announced this week the payload for its next mission, and it is none other than Boeing's X-37B spaceplane. This winged spacecraft will be launching no earlier than December 7th on SpaceX's next Falcon Heavy mission, USSF-52. This is an interesting rocket to launch the X-37B on, as previous launches of this spaceplane were carried out on medium-lift launch vehicles like the Atlas V or the Falcon 9 in an RTLS landing configuration. A Falcon Heavy is simply too overkill if the spacecraft were to be going to the same orbits as previous launches. However, according to the US Space Force, this mission would include new orbital regimes, which would explain the need for a larger and heavier rocket to push the spacecraft into a more weird orbit. Where will it go? Well, nobody knows. Well, the Space Force knows, we don't, and that's how it's meant to work, I guess. And now let's take a look at what's coming up next week in spaceflight. After a few days of delay, SpaceX is preparing to launch the Transporter 9 mission as soon as November 11th from Vandenberg. The 55-minute launch window is set to open at 1849 UTC. The flight is the 9th in SpaceX's small-sat rideshare program and will be carrying 113 payloads into a sun-synchronous orbit. We'll also have another Falcon 9 launch with SES's next two O3b mPOWER satellites headed for a medium transfer orbit. Liftoff is set to occur on November 12th within an 89-minute window that opens at 2108 UTC. And if all goes well with regulatory approval, Starship could be making its second test flight as soon as November 15th within a 2-hour 39-minute window that opens at 1300 UTC. I'm Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in next week to recap this week in spaceflight.